The first time I thought about going to Africa was in 1984. It was when we were first seeing footage of the famine in Ethiopia, and I had a small child at the time, and I remembered watching the television and thinking, if I didn't have a small child, I would go. I didn't know what I would do or how I could help, but I thought surely there must be something I could do. But I had a small family, and so I waited. In 2008, many years later, I was able to take my first trip to Tanzania on a medical caravan. And I remember that first day standing on the stairs weighing people as they came in to seek health care. There were many people in the line. And I remember looking out at the line and thinking that there was no place else I'd rather be, that it was, that I'd been waiting a long time to be there. So I traveled to Africa on medical caravan for many years. And then in 2013, I had been hearing about Heather Haynes for a while. We were both traveling to Tanzania, but not together. So her world was kind of here and my world was here, and we were circling each other's worlds. And I messaged her one day and said, I think we should get together and talk. So I came to the gallery to meet with her, and our worlds collided. We talked about Tanzania, about the things we'd seen, the places we'd been, and our experiences, and there was a heart connection there. She started telling me about a book she wanted to write about the women of East Africa, and I had been wanting to write a book too, so I asked if somehow I could be a part of that. So we talked a little bit more, and she told me about being in the Congo, and she was going again in 2014 in February. So I asked if I could go too. I was nervous. The Congo is something that you hear crazy stories about, but I wanted to go. I wanted to go with her. I wanted to meet the people there. I wanted to hear the stories. So we went together, and when we arrived at the Tchukudu kids' home, there were 10 women waiting for us to tell us their stories. We had no idea that many women would be there. We were expecting 2 or 3 maybe. 10 women were there, and so we sat and we listened to their stories, and they were heartbreaking. They were stories about sexual violence and war, conflict, fleeing from their villages, losing their children, their husbands being murdered in front of their eyes. Each woman had her own story, but at the same time, a thread ran through the stories. It's so similar. These women were farmers. They came from villages far from the city, had some of them never been to the city, and they find themselves now in the city, having flown from the conflict. And they had no homes, they had no skills. They were working as porters, carrying very heavy loads to try and make a few cents to be able to feed themselves and their children. They were living under tarps, some of them in the IDP, internally displaced persons camp, some of them just in the city. So we heard their stories and we left. We waved goodbye and left, and I was just cracked wide open. And I said to Heather on our way home that I needed to do something, that surely we could do something for these women that would help them just in some small way to make their lives a little bit better. So we talked on the way home in the airplane and thought about what we could do. Maybe we could send money, and Heather's friend Kazungu, who I've grown to know and love, we emailed him and talked to him about this, and he said, no, sending money's not the answer. He told the story about the fish. You teach the person to fish, you don't give them a fish, and then they can feed themselves for their life. So that's where the idea of the Tchukudu Women's Training Center came from. We would create a place where the women could come, where they could learn some skills so that they could make some money to feed themselves and to feed their children, to send their children to school, which is so important to them, something that each and every one of them talked about. So my husband owns a local financial firm here in Kingston. He provided us some money to get started, so we bought 16 sewing machines, we found a place that we could use, and the women began, 16 women. And then we put the word out on Facebook, both Heather and I, and we found 16 Canadian women, each one to sponsor one of her Congolese sisters. And the women who came forward were just so lovely and so heart open themselves, and not having even been there, they were wanting to support the women and wanting to help them and their children. So the sewing center, the training center, the women learned to sew for 1 year. When we were there, when we first met the women were very flat. Emotionally, they were quite traumatized, eyes down. When we came back this year in April of 2015, the women were singing and dancing, and the smiles on their face was, well, it was just worth everything. And so we were fortunate to be there for a full week to spend with the women and the children. 31 women were waiting for us this time, and so we did get to talk to many of those. 16 of those women have now started the sewing training. The first group has now moved on to a working shop where they're starting to sew things for sale and learning about business and how they will be able to make their way as entrepreneurs. The second group has started their sewing, the 16 women, and then we had 15 women. So we asked the women, what else would you like to learn? And they wanted to learn basket weaving, and they brought me a basket and showed me how that would work, and Marguerite would be able to teach them. And so we're going to start basket weaving as well. We're putting a fence up around the Tchukudu Women's Training Center compound so that it's safe and secure for them, and they can easily get through to the Tchukudu Kids Home with the children and to the school, which will be built beside.